Hi, welcome to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. I'm Nina Melendez, and today we have a special episode where we're discussing the events happening right now in Texas. What you're looking at are images of Texas. The state is currently under a state of emergency after days of record-breaking cold temperatures. Hundreds of thousands woke up this morning to the fifth day of rolling blackouts, and millions still don't have access to heat and clean running water. So how and why did it get so bad? Here to help break it down for us is Daniel Yergin. Daniel is Vice Chairman of IHS Markit, and he's also the author of the new map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. Dan, welcome to the show.
Glad to be with you.
Dan, I want to start because Texas has a unique power grid system. Can you explain a little bit about how it gets its energy sources?
Well, Texas is different from the rest of the country in that it has its own electric power system that's not really connected with the rest of the country. In terms of where its energy comes from, number one source for electricity has been natural gas, almost half. Wind is about a quarter, which is a big increase from a decade ago when it was just 8%. So that's how it is normally when you're not having weather like they've just had in Texas.
So conceivably then, if, say, one source of energy fails, like the coal, they're not able to access its coal reserves, or the renewable energy fails, they can complement each other, but that's not what happened in this case. Can you explain that to us?
Sure. What happened is it was really interconnected. Everything went down. The Texas electricity system is really set up to deal with 100-degree weather in the summer for several days, and not for single-digit weather for several days in the winter. And so what happened is that really demand was shooting through the roof, much higher than had been planned for, even in an extreme situation. And at the same time, kind of all the electricity sources, to one degree or another, went kaput because basically the real villain here was ice, which froze up.
So in a weird way, it was kind of like the perfect storm. Well,
I think this is one case, Nina, where the term perfect storm really does make sense, because that's exactly what happened. Because, for instance, I mean, you ran the wind turbines couldn't run because there was ice on the blades, and if they ran them, they were out of balance and they would not work. So they had to be shut down. And then it turns out that the natural gas wells many of them run on electricity. So as electricity got disrupted and they were taken off the system, they couldn't send gas. So you didn't have gas that was going to the generating plants to generate the electricity. So it was like a vicious circle happened during those very cold days, which just exceeded anything that had been planned for.
So why does Texas do it this way? Why are they off the national grid?
Well, that's just a decision that Texas said, well, we'll do it ourselves, and we're a big state. We won't interconnect with the rest of the country. And so they have their own grid system. They can get a little bit of power elsewhere, but not much. And so, they'll probably, I think is also because they didn't want to be regulated by the federal government. So they just stayed as a Texas entity. And most of the time it works, but it certainly didn't work today or this week. And they had a similar episode in 2011 where cold weather came and led to the same kind of disruption, although not on this scale.
I'm happy you brought up the regulation, because that has sort of been a contentious issue here with this, that perhaps the deregulation is one of the many factors of the problem. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? What happened with the regulation? Why did they deregulate?
Well, I mean, deregulation is a relative term when you come to electric power, because it's still one that's managed, but it was kind of a more market-oriented system. And it's what's happened around the country. A lot of utilities are now only have what are called wires. They send electricity, but somebody else does the generation. And so our country is divided in where we have old style utilities that do everything. And these in Texas is part of the one that went towards that deregulation. But still, there's heavy government control at the end of the day. And there's going to be more government intervention after this, particularly to weatherize these installations so that they don't freeze up, because it all came down to ice, which is what was a real problem.
Dan, I want to take a moment to say hi to some of the members who are joining us today live on the stream. We have Victoria, Manuel, and Stacy from Texas. I hope you guys are doing okay and staying safe and warm. Andrea in Florida, Hussein in Syria, Helen in Connecticut, Stacy in Illinois. Thanks so much for joining us live. If you have any questions for Daniel, please feel free to put them in the stream. He is Pulitzer Prize winning author, a brilliant man. We want to pick his brain. Let us know. So Daniel, that kind of brings me to my next question. You mentioned the ice. I think of Massachusetts, which is what I call my home state. What if we have the polar opposite happening there? So for example, instead of ice in Massachusetts, which they're used to and prepared for, what if they have heat waves that that causes everyone to now start putting on their ACs, air conditioning on, and does the same, just opposite? How can we prevent across the country something like this from happening again, from Texas to Maine to Massachusetts and California?
Well, Massachusetts has actually had problems in the winter too. It had a polar vortex a few years ago, and where on the one hand it needed liquefied natural gas, which comes by ship that couldn't be landed, and it has inadequate pipeline capacity to bring in natural gas from other parts of the country. So Massachusetts has suffered for it too. So I think the message here is you have to build resilience into these systems. You need flexibility in these systems, and you need to think about worst cases, and in some cases, think about even beyond the worst case.
That actually brings me to a question from Ned in the comments. He said that he used to work in the Alberta oil patch where the temperatures regularly fell to -20s. So the question is, why did the Texas oil and gas infrastructure have trouble with the conditions that were arguably milder than that? Do you have an answer for that?
Well, certainly, yeah. Alberta, Canada, northern part of the United States, things keep working because they, in a sense, put in insulation or weatherization to assure that there's heat or de-icing and so forth that you typically didn't do in Houston or in Texas, really, because it just seemed that this kind of weather wasn't something that was going to hit Texas. And yet there have been a number of episodes since 1983, about 8 of them that I could count, when there's been cold weather that has shocked the system. But I think going forward, and the governor has said that there's now going to be that kind of investment, some of the kind of investment that you see in Canada going into the Texas system to make sure this doesn't happen again and cause the terrible hardships that people experienced in the first part of the week. By the way, most of the bulk of the customers now are back online in Texas. There are about 150,000 at last count. But the big problem now for people is, of course, water. Pipes froze, the water systems malfunctioned because they didn't have power. And so the next challenge over the next few days is to get the water back running.
So Dan, you mentioned this has happened again. All I can think of is in 2011, but you said since the 80s this has happened several times. Several comments I saw on the stream were saying, if this happens once every 50 years, why spend billions of dollars to prevent something that actually doesn't happen all that often? So that's incorrect then. This actually happens, maybe not often, but it happens several times in a lifetime.
Yeah, I mean, that is a question people could say, well, if it's just a once in 50 years, do you want to spend the money on that? But I think we can see it's more frequent than that. And I think the other thing that's happening, Nina, is, of course, our society is getting more and more and more electrified, more and more dependent upon electricity. So you need the electricity system to be 100% reliable.
Yeah. Dan, I want to bring up the poll. We've been polling professionals on the platform. And for those of you watching, feel free to weigh in. The question is, how should energy producers adjust to meet seasonal demand? So is it by adding infrastructure, spending that money we were just talking about? Is it diversifying energy sources or preparedness planning? And if there's another option, let us know. We'll revisit these answers.
Well, I think the answer is very clear, Nina. All of the above. You need
all
to do all of it. You've got to plan for extreme events. And in Texas, ERCOT, which manages the grid, planned for extreme events. It just turned out the extreme events were more extreme than what their planning was. And so I think, California has the same question about resilience in its electric power system. So if we're going to depend more on it, we need, I think, all 3 of those options that you had there have got to be part of the mix. And I think the public will demand it. People do not want to, people really suffered in Texas. They don't want to go through that again. And I think they'll be, willing to pay the additional costs that maybe before seemed, kind of
I was
not
just
necessary.
yeah, I was just gonna say, Dan, all of the above sounds really expensive. Will people want to shell out the extra money for this?
Well, it would be reflected, but the cost of the kind of breakdown they've had is much more. I'm not sure if it's really expensive, but it is more money, and it has to go into the rate base. And there's a tendency, to say, well, we want to keep utility prices really low, but I think they're going to have to be a little bit higher to put money into it and spread it out across the system, and to look at the interconnections. That one thing it was really a systemic failure, and it came very close within minutes of actually the whole grid going down if they hadn't really started, as they say, shedding load, which means reducing power or running rolling blackouts and so forth, and actually just cutting power. And if the system had gone down, it could have taken months to repair it. It would have been a much bigger disaster.
So there's also this idea going around that the renewable energy is sort of the problem. And you mentioned earlier the icicles forming on the wind turbines. Is that a correct assessment that in fact, maybe the diversification of Texas's energy sources is why, especially renewables, is why this happened? What's your take?
I think some people want to say it was renewables, some people want to say it was natural gas. I go back to where we started. The problem was ice, and that was a problem for the wind turbines, and it was a problem for the gas wells for both of them. So I think people will debate what the balance was, but the system needs to be weatherized and have that resilience that you've been talking about. Clearly, Texas has moved to a much larger role for wind. California is wind and solar as well. And the problem with wind and solar is that they're intermittent. But if there was heating there, if like you're the person who worked in Alberta, if they'd done that on the wind turbines like they do in Canada, you wouldn't necessarily have seen this problem. So it was really a system issue. And I think, as you say, I think the villain is ice.
Question for you. What about nuclear? So we've talked about renewable and coal. What about nuclear? Is that an option?
Well, Texas has nuclear power plants, and it has two, and I think one of them also went down and wasn't operating. But nuclear does give you, in general, what's called base load, that it will operate all the time. Obviously, we're not building new nuclear power plants in the United States now. There are a couple that are being finished, but not new ones. But one of the things I talk about in the new map is that there's this next generation of nuclear, which would be smaller, so-called modular nuclear power plants. And, we're several years away from it, but that could be part of it too, because you do need, the thing about wind and solar, they have big contributions, but they're not constant. And you do need what's called baseload generation to help smooth things out when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing or the blades freeze up.
Right. Dan, I just want to say hi to a couple more members joining us. We have Justin, Matthew, and Diana from Colorado. We have Alfred in Canada, Reggie in New York, Stanley in New Mexico, Fernando in Chile, Esther from New York City. Thanks for joining. And Dan, I have a question for you from Mariana. She says, hello, Daniel, fellow Yaley here. I really enjoyed your books. Where can those of us interested in energy work help solve these problems in the long run?
Well, I think there are lots of places. I think there's a lot, there are a whole host of different private sector companies. Obviously, there's government. Some people work in NGOs. And I think the other thing is that we're in an era of tremendous innovation in new ideas and startups in energy to a degree that we haven't seen before. So I think there's plenty of opportunities. And you're talking about, modern world runs on energy. So getting these foundations to work requires people with talent and capability and commitment.
So that actually brings me to my next question, which is what the energy landscape will look like in about 20 years and potentially where the jobs might be.
Well, I think there will be more jobs in renewables as that grows. I think this is something I really kind of spent a lot of time thinking about in writing the new map, and it is that we have an energy mix. Today, about 80% of the energy that the US runs on is fossil fuels. I think in 20 years, that mix will change. We'll have more renewables. We'll get people talk about hydrogen, electric cars, and so forth. But I think also oil and gas will still be part of the energy mix. And therefore, part of that will be developing what's called carbon capture, so that you can basically, as the name says, capture the carbon in order to meet the climate goals. So, and I think 20 years from now, the world economy is going to be a lot bigger than it is today. So it's going to need a lot of energy. And I should add one other thing. I was just looking at our economic forecast, and we're showing that by the second quarter of this year, the U.S. economy will be stronger than it was in 2019. So economic recovery is on the horizon, and with that will come more energy use.
So I'm curious, as you're forward looking, because you've been in this industry for so long, is there anything that you are surprised about where we are now? Something that you looked at maybe in the 90s that you projected, and in 2020 we'll be here. Is there something that you're surprised about that we're either not adopting or we're still too reliant on fossil fuels?
Well, I'm struck by the adoption of the 2050 goals for net zero carbon. It doesn't mean not using fossil fuels, but on a net basis, and all the different forms that carbon capture, including plants, will be. So I think that is really, even in the last year, that has become a much stronger theme and embraced. And I think people should keep their eyes on what happens in Glasgow, beginning on November 1st in Scotland, because that's the successor to the Paris Climate Conference. And there's going to be a lot of effort going into that. And I think that coming out of that, there will be, it will kind of clarify the energy directions. But I'm also struck by the fact, I think the other thing, and this, I wrote a whole chapter on this in the book, that we tend to look at things from the viewpoint of, the advanced industrial nations like the United States or Western Europe. But if you're in India, where I've been doing work, they're thinking about energy in a different way. They're thinking about wind and solar, but they're also thinking about a lot of poor people, hundreds of millions who burn waste wood and things like that and have indoor air pollution. And so they want to have more natural gas, more commercial energy in their system. So I think there are different perspectives around the world depending upon the nature of your economy.
Is there a country that's doing it right, and what are they doing right that we're not?
Well, I don't think, no, I think different countries have gone on different paths. Germany is a very rich country, and so they pushed renewables pretty hard. I mean, it's interesting to watch China, because on the one hand, China is adding a lot of new coal-fired plants every year. On the other hand, they have announced that they have a 2060 goal for net zero carbon, sorry. And, they have the wind turbines, half the solar in the world is in China. And China supplies about 80% of the solar panels in the world. So, I mean, China's sort of kind of on both sides of the street.
Do you think that we'll hit our 2050 goal of net zero? What are your thoughts?
I'm not sure. I think a lot of effort's going to go into it. The Biden administration is going to go all out on it. It will worry about other things like jobs and so forth. I don't know if we'll hit the goal in 2050, but I'd say the directionally it's clear where things are going.
That's good. That's positive. I like the positive outlook. I have one more question for you. In your book, you write that climate change is reshaping the map, and we were just sort of talking about the map right now. I would love for you to explain a little bit more about what you mean. Climate change is reshaping the map, the energy map.
Well, in using the term map in the new map, I meant both literal maps, like the map of the South China Sea or the map of energy distribution in the United States. And I meant it metaphorically, like the America's map. What's really reshaped America's map in energy in recent decades is the shale revolution. The United States has gone from importing 60% of its oil to being energy independent, in fact, exporting oil. And by the climate map, I meant, again, metaphorically, it will change the balance of energy resources, and it will change the positions of different countries. That, if you're in the Middle East, some of the oil exporting countries, are trying to diversify their economy because they're not sure what will be the demands for oil in the world in the year 2050. They know there'll be demand for it, they're just not sure. So I think the map of energy is also the map of political power. It's the map of flows of money, all of those things together. So it is a kind of, it's really changing the mental maps over the decades to come.
Dan, I actually have one last question for you before we go. What is it that you want people to walk away with? Bringing it back to Texas and thinking about what's happening there. What do you want the country to walk away with after a crisis like this?
I think that I would like, energy security has been such a big issue for decades. Now that we're energy independent, we sort of have forgotten about it. But I think we have to keep in mind what you had in your survey there, the importance of resilience, of backup, of ability to recover quickly and to prepare, because we're so dependent upon these systems. If that crisis had gone on another few minutes in Texas, that system could have been down for months, and we just can't allow that to happen. So I think that's the lesson, is that we need to spend the extra resources to prepare not just for an extreme situation, but something beyond an extreme situation, so that it doesn't become a crisis.
Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. It was lovely having you on. Great seeing you again. And thank you for making the time.
Great. I'm glad to be with you. We'll see you again. Thanks.
See you again.
And goodbye, everybody.
That was Daniel Yergin. He is the author of The New Map and also vice chairman of IHS Markit. And earlier today, we were asking you about the poll that Dan mentioned. Let's take a look at some of the answers. We asked, how should energy producers adjust to meet seasonal demand? And you said 16% adding infrastructure, and 28% of you said diversifying energy sources. But the most of you said preparedness planning. So there you go. Great responses. Thank you so much for participating. I am Nina Melendez. It was great having you on today. Later this afternoon, my colleague Andrew Seaman will be speaking with Jennifer Tardy. She works with both job seekers and recruiters, and she will answer your questions about how you can land a job during these turbulent times. Thanks again for watching LinkedIn News Live. I'm Nina Melendez.